Good Sunday morning. I'm Jaden Jefferson, and welcome to this week's Community Focus. On last week's show, I was joined by Marcus Roth from the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio for his organization's perspective on a Supreme Court ruling that allows municipalities to fine unhoused individuals who sleep in public. His organization was not in favor of the ruling, but the National League of Cities is in favor of it, saying it helps cities better make decisions about addressing homelessness. Here's my full conversation with a representative from the NLC. Take a look.
So the National League of Cities is a national organization. We represent the nation's cities, towns, and villages. There's over 19,000 cities, towns, and villages. And part of the National League of Cities efforts is to do advocacy on various different levels. So we have a legal advocacy program that we do in partnership with other associations through an entity called the Local Government Legal Center. And we joined this case through submitting an amicus brief. And we've joined other cases at the Supreme Court level and actually at the lower federal court levels as well. And our legal advocacy efforts are important to the National League of Cities because we know that federal law is important. We know that the courts are deciding a lot of important legal matters that matter to local governments for various different reasons. But we joined the Grants Pass v. Johnson case by submitting an amicus brief to it. And in that amicus brief, we shared a lot of different information about the impact of this case to local governments. And we believe that this case is a big deal to cities. We believe this case has a big impact to local governments, and that the decision of the case, what the courts decided on, was a big win for local governments. And it was a win for local governments because now we have the clarity on what the ability is for local governments to make the best decisions for the public health and safety for all of their residents, including those residents that are in their community and that are unhoused. And I'll just start by saying, Jaden, that I want to emphasize that what's truly at issue in this case is the ability and authority for city executives and local leaders to make the best decisions in the interests of their community members. And we believe at the National League of Cities that the local leaders and city executives are really on the frontline response to various issues in their community, including the homelessness issue. And they're the best equipped to make the decisions about the best ways that they can serve all of their residents, including their unhoused populations. And the decision doesn't really decide homelessness policy broadly, but what it does instead is grant cities the clarity on what they can do to support the unique and specific needs of their communities. And so we really joined this case. The National League of Cities took interest in this case. We joined the case through an amicus brief because we felt like it was important that local officials and local governments receive that clarity on what they can really do to enact a common sense measures to address homelessness that's going on within all communities of all sizes.
And obviously, when we talk about this issue, there are two things you're balancing, which is, of course, addressing homelessness while also addressing the needs of those who are housed. And so how can cities actually balance that under this new policy or new guidance that they have from the Supreme Court?
Yeah, absolutely, Jaden. That's a really great question. And I'm glad that you brought up cities having to balance these different issues. And I wouldn't say necessarily that it's all about balancing competing issues between different populations within their community, but rather this case is important because what it does do, again, is provide clarity on the authority that local governments have to actually make these decisions. So this decision was absolutely important because it allowed local governments to understand what they could really do to make decisions about the public health and safety interests for all members of their community, including both different types of populations. And in terms of what local governments are doing, they're focused on solutions to the homelessness issue as they have been for a really long time. And so they're addressing this issue in their communities in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different practices and measures, policies that local governments have been doing for a long time to address the homelessness issue. Things like emergency housing and making sure all of their residents have a place to go and sleep. They'll be addressing the greater local housing supply to increase the amount of housing in their communities. They'll not just be investing in social services to support the lives and needs of their residents, but also connecting their residents with those services. And so local governments it's not about necessarily the competing interests between the unhoused population and those that have housing, but this decision was important because it gave them the authority to make decisions for all of their residents, the public health and the safety for all of them.
And obviously, in the case of Grants Pass, Oregon, the city that really spurred this, they were finding individuals who were homeless. And so, is that a common thing among cities, or is this just one case that could mean other cities can do their own types of things?
Yeah, so Grants Pass, that's a great question, Jaden. Grants Pass, of course, with the facts of the case, they had enacted this ordinance that had fines that were tied to it, and that's an example of a local policy that addresses homelessness. But that isn't the policy necessarily that the courts are upholding here. It, I really want to emphasize that compassionately addressing homelessness is at the top of priorities for a lot of different local leaders. As we talk to local leaders day in and day out, we know that what they're looking for out there is how to protect their most vulnerable residents. And there's a lot of different tools that local leaders have done and continue to do to address homelessness. But what they're most caring about is looking out for the most vulnerable residents on the top of things. So the practices that Grants Pass had was one example of how local governments are addressing homelessness within communities. But the decision itself isn't upholding that particular practice. There's a lot of different ways that local governments are working to provide for the best solutions, the best results for the homelessness population within their communities.
What are some of the cities that are represented, some of the cities, towns that are represented by the National League of Cities aiming to do under this new ruling?
Good question, Jaden. So under this ruling, again, what this ruling does is really provide that clarity for the local authority that local governments have to enact the best practices and policies for the needs of their individual communities. And so what they'll be doing under this ruling, what they'll be doing is really focusing on the solutions that they have been focusing on for a really long time. Just as I've talked about before, local officials know that they have to address the homelessness problem from a holistic viewpoint. And so they'll be really concentrating on more emergency housing, making sure their residents all have a place to go and sleep. They're going to be addressing the local housing supply, making sure that there's enough supply within their communities for housing. And then beyond housing, what local officials will be doing is really partnering with the different stakeholders to invest and support social service programs that will support the lives and needs of their residents and connecting them with their services. And I think that's important to call out that there's a really immense need right now for the federal, state, and local government levels to be working together and partnering to address the complex needs of the local communities and their residents. It's extremely important that all levels of government work together to find more than solutions, but also provide support to the unhoused communities that are across the nations. So after this ruling has come down and local governments have received the clarity that they needed in terms of understanding what their authority is, they're going to continue to, and they have taken a holistic approach to finding ways to meet their residents' needs. Because again, they're working hard to keep their entire community safe and healthy.
And last week I had spoke to someone with the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, and it was kind of brought up that obviously we've made a lot of progress in addressing homelessness, but yet there are still a lot of unhoused people and more people entering homelessness each day. And so how can a city keep up when that's definitely something that they have to address, but have limited funds and support to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jaden. And I want to call back to a point that I just made in the last answer, which was that there's an immense need for federal, state, and local partnership. We know that local communities cannot address this issue all on their own. There's a great need for all levels of government and stakeholders and interested parties to partner together to not just find solutions right now, but also to find the support and ways as they work to support the needs of their residents.
And what is the guidance that residents have given to their city officials? I'm sure there are plenty of cities, municipalities that are part of the National League of Cities, and I'm sure they've heard from their residents at some point about the homelessness issue. So what are cities hearing, and what are some ideas they've come about with regard to homelessness in addition to housing?
Thank you so much, Jaden, for that question, because you're right. This is not a new issue by any means to cities. And I'll also say that this is not a simple issue to cities, right? And so as you've mentioned, I'm sure that they've heard from numerous residents on various different perspectives on this matter. And we also at the National League of Cities have heard very different perspectives on this matter for sure, because it is a complex issue. And actually, the parties that argued this case before the Supreme Court, one of the things that, most commentators agreed upon was that homelessness is a complex issue. So there isn't one solution that fits all. Housing alone solution that fits all for addressing the homelessness issue by any means. But what this decision has allowed local governments to do is have the authority to enact some of these common sense practices and measures that were previously banned in the Ninth Circuit because of the previous decision in Martin v. Boise. And instead, this decision enables local governments to be able to really find ways to address the homelessness issue that best serve the needs, the unique and specific needs of their residents in their community. And the National League of Cities has various resources in terms of the different homelessness or the different practices that are related to homelessness and the different solutions that local governments have enacted. And local governments really know the needs of their communities best. Local governments are sort of the frontline response for the homelessness issue. They know, and each community is unique, and there are specific needs and different needs in each community. So they're really the ones that are set up in order to address what the community really needs in terms of policies and practices. But again, this decision allows for them to have that clarity so that they can start enacting their own local measures that best serve the public safety and health of their residents.
Is it the NLC's belief that advocacy groups should also be a part of this?
Thanks, Jaden. The NLC itself, we are taking upon ourselves to do advocacy on this. And I think we saw through this case, there was a lot of advocacy groups that were part of weighing into the Supreme Court in terms of the decision and the legal issue that was before the court. NLC really partners with a lot of different organizations on various pieces of this topic. Again, we've partnered with the Local Government Legal Center, which is comprised of various associations that are similarly situated to NLC so that we can address common questions like this among us. But hopefully that answers your question in terms of our advocacy.
Yeah, and then specifically, are there any homelessness advocacy groups that may have been a part of this discussion or you guys have brought to the table on this?
Thanks, Jaden. Yeah, there's a lot of homelessness groups and advocacy groups that have definitely been active voices as part of this conversation for sure. In terms of who NLC has engaged with in the rest of our programming and our housing programs and our homelessness programs and our health programs, I can't speak to that for sure in the specificity, but NLC definitely, we've had extensive conversations on this topic, and we've published an extensive amount of resources on this topic as well. And so I'll leave that there, Jaden, and just refer those materials.
And then looking toward the future, what's going to be the next few steps in terms of finding solutions and taking what has already worked and implementing it in more cities?
That's a great question, Jaden. And, kind of goes back to the answer that I provided before, which is sort of what's next for local governments on this issue of homelessness. And this isn't a new issue, as I said, for local governments. And so now that local governments have had that clarity that they need to understand what their authority is in their local decision making, it allows for local governments to focus on what solutions fit the needs of their community the best. And whether that be addressing housing needs or whether that be addressing more social services and connecting their residents with social services or strengthening their partnerships with the federal and state level. I think this case has uplifted just how complex and large the issue of homelessness is in communities of all sizes across the nation. And so what's next for local governments is that they're going to continue just jumping in and diving into taking that holistic approach, finding the ways that they can meet their residents' needs. And whether that be through different policies and practices that were discussed in the case, or whether that be through other best practices that NLC has looked at in the past, local governments know the needs of their communities best, and each community has a specific set of those needs.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jaden. Appreciate you.
And that's this week's Community Focus. I'm Jaden Jefferson. Thanks so much for joining me, and have a great rest of your week.